Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here is your host, Sean Graham.
Welcome to the History Slam podcast. I'm Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Waterloo, Ontario. We're on the campus of the University of Waterloo, home of the Fightin' Warriors. We're here as part of the CHA conference, and in the past 10 years, it seems as though it's been impossible to open a newspaper or watch the news without hearing about how overweight we are as a society. With shows like The Biggest Loser, documenting efforts to lose weight, and sitcoms like The Office making light of weight loss efforts. It seems as though the theme of the 21st century has been about our own waistlines. Of course, the fact that we're putting wheels in kids' shoes and finding more ways to put cheese in a slice of pizza may be part of the problem. It hasn't always been this way, however, as for years Participaction and Body Break encourage Canadians to get active and be fit, but we haven't been graced with Hal Johnston's mustache in quite a while. So to help us figure out where it went and track the course of Participaction, we welcome to the podcast Victoria Lamb-Drover of the University of Saskatchewan. Did I get that right?
Yes, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for doing this.
No problem.
So as I said, we're here at the CHA. You gave a talk this morning about Participaction, and you entitled it "How Video Killed the Radio Star." I'm just curious as to where that title came from.
Well, the Bengals is where it came from. Well, like a lot of papers, I had a concept and had an idea and had to throw it out there, and then I had 6 months to continue my research and realized that what I talked about today was probably a little bit more interesting. And Participaction employed a three-prong attack, so it did employ TV, radio, and print from the beginning, from the 1970s. It included that. I think I like the video killed the radio star reference when we're talking about the digital age and the corporate inability for them to work in a digital era. They were people who had started working in health promotion in the 1970s. The president, Russ Kisby, was kind of afraid of technology, warning against the use of the Walkman. So he wasn't able to make that jump. And so the video killed the radio star, I think it harkens back to an earlier media transition. So
And it's interesting to use that reference because it's such a brand, though, right? Because it has these two-pronged attack, three-pronged attack, and yet it's maybe detrimental in some way.
I think they spread their resources, but what I think why Participaction was effective is it was one of the first public service campaigns to employ three-pronged attack, and to realize that you're going to hit different demographics with different media, and the importance of employing a national campaign and local campaigns. And they did that very economically by producing little ads and little cartoons that could be inserted in blank spaces in newspapers, but also creating in local newspapers, but also creating sort of national TV spots. So they were trying to hit us, in the local paper that we loved and the CTV or CBC that we consumed. So that was, they were very innovative in that, but they weren't able to keep up with that innovation when the digital age hit.
Right, but still effective in that. I think was this. You had a statistic with 94%?
96% of Canadians. It's drawn from a study in 2004. After Participaction had been folded for 3 years, 96% of Canadians could identify it either by its iconic pinwheel logo or by one of its campaigns, such as Body Break. Right. What's interesting about Body Break is that Hal Johnson and Joanne McLeod owned that name, and they only were affiliated with Participaction for the first 3 years. After that, Hal Johnson and Joanne McLeod wanted to take it, and from my sources it seems like the relationship was amicably broken, but they wanted to take it in a more corporate direction. They wanted to endorse sports equipment, get corporate sponsors, things that Participaction wasn't entirely comfortable with. So they split. Body Break continued to be produced, but produced by Hal Johnson and Joanne McLeod.
Right.
Interestingly, Canadians didn't recognize that separation, and the link between Participaction and Body Break has continued in the Canadian psyche, even though only 3 years of them were produced by the organization.
Yeah.
Hal Johnson and Joanne McLeod brought the idea to Participaction, and they sort of roughed out the edges of it for them. So.
Is it bad that I didn't know they were married until today? Is that bad of me?
No,
as a side note?
No, it's not. It's not bad of you. It's also not bad of you to know that that Hal Johnson was of mixed race African American descent, because it was kind of difficult to tell. It was only through my research that I sort of learned this, because most people just assumed because they had different names that they weren't married, and there was nothing overt in any of the messages that said that they were.
Yeah, it's not like they had this great chemistry
on
camera or anything. But I think Hal Johnson, excuse me, with all due respect to what's her first? Joanne McLeod, is probably the more recognizable of the two. And I think I told you the story this morning. A buddy of mine recently for Halloween went as Hal Johnson.
But he went as the old school Hal Johnson.
Yeah,
because with the new
mustache.
Campaign, he shaved. He shaved.
Oh, well, then there's no point. He should just retire.
He should just retire. He's no longer recognizable.
Exactly.
I think it's very much like when Selleck went without the stash for a while. It just seemed unnatural.
Yeah. It's, at some point, you just have to keep it.
Yeah.
But having someone who's so recognizable and having a brand that's so recognizable generally with Participaction, does that make researching it easier or harder? Because everyone will have a personal story about it. So does that maybe get in the way and take time away from actually your research and doing oral interviews, or does it make it more accessible, or does it make it easier to get into the material?
Entirely more accessible. Yeah. I have an amazing archives to work with, which no one else has touched before extensively, and the research that way is wonderful. And orally, people want to talk about this. It's something that we all have a connection to. And I've never had an academic project where I can say, I'm doing one word and people know exactly what I'm talking about.
Right.
Academia always seems can seem elitist and difficult to understand, and particularly when you're trying to contact people who have nothing to do with academia about a cultural or social history. And this is so accessible and so easy for people to understand that I'm able to speak to them, and I think that they're at ease on this, because although it does touch on difficult topics such as obesity, I don't think people see it as a difficult topic to discuss.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting statement, that we're talking about health decisions and people still have a smile on their face about it. So.
Because it was never presented in a way that was challenging.
It was challenging, but I think in an upbeat way, and that was a key part of their branding and messaging. They always wanted to be a positive, humorous message, because no one wants to be harped on to get off the couch.
Right.
And they understood that early. They also understood that in Canadian advertising, we're not looking for success. You don't see Canadian ads focusing on, if you get this car, you'll be the coolest person on your street. They're humorous. They're self-deprecating. It's not the American style of advertisements. That's why British ads often translate very well in Canadian markets. It's because it's a similar type of humor. And Participaction understood that early on and really employed it. So
right. Yeah. So, but if we talk about the beginnings, and so was there really a need for it, or was it just something that Hal Johnson, Joanne McLeod had this idea in Saskatoon?
Oh yeah, no. Hal Johnson and Joanne McLeod, they arrived at the scene much later.
Okay.
The creation of Participaction is part of a larger conversation going on with health experts starting in the post-war period. The need to surveil the health of Canadians and make sure they're living healthy lives, and that can take on sinister connotations. But health experts are also trying to create for themselves a niche, an industry, and after the 1951, there was the first WHO international conference on health education, and health education. We've all seen those corny 1950s health movies that were shown in classes.
Oh yeah, Little Johnny.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And surprisingly, those proved ineffective. And so by the 1970s, they realized we need to start targeting people in a different way. So that is the conversation that that Participaction's beginning speaks to. They wanted to target people on an individual level, and they didn't just deliver it in classrooms. Participation created ads for seniors complexes and workplaces. They created the health strategy for Canadian Forces, for the RCMP. They were pervasive, and they realized that if they inundated Canadians with their message, that sooner or later it would sink in.
Right. Now, is it at all related to maybe the sexual revolution part of the 70s? People are more aware of their bodies. There's more freedom to talk about these issues.
Well, I think that people are probably more aware of their bodies. I don't know. I don't know if it speaks a whole lot to the sexual revolution. They were aware that they needed to be very gender neutral in their programming, that they needed to, when they provided these really wonderful surveys that are in the archives, of a checklist of how to tell when you're obese, and they did provide one for men versus one for women, and so they were aware of that. But I don't think that the political activism that you would see in the sexual rights movement at the time really comes into play with Participation. I think later on, we're talking about the 1990s, when they're saying, you know what, hold the phone. We've been focusing on people, and people aren't making the decisions we want them to make. Let's focus on larger societal change. Let's look at poverty and how that affects health. Let's look at housing and education and how that affects health choices. And when we move to a more what's called population health model rather than health promotion model, then we're talking about politicization. But that's a conversation that Participation isn't a part of,
right.
And it no longer has an ideological footing in health and health theorizing after that.
Oh, okay. So, no, but it strikes me as while you're talking about this, I went to the University of Regina. I lived in Saskatchewan for a couple of years. It surprises me that all this is starting in Saskatoon. I don't know why that surprises me. I don't think there's a reason why it surprises me, but it seems to me that this sort of national organization that gets such brand recognition would be out of Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal.
Okay.
So why Saskatoon? And why do you think it was successful being born? Or was it just the people? Did it have anything to do with Saskatoon specifically, or the University of Saskatchewan? Or, was it just because of who was there?
I think that, I'm going to give a real historian response and say it's complicated. Saskatchewan has a long history of progressivism. The University of Saskatchewan has a long history of progressive policies. Gender inclusive from its founding, and all faculties, gender blind salary grids. It's founded on progressive thoughts and ideas. And
Hilda Neepy was
Hilda
that, right?
Neepy,
and you get the tradition of Tommy Douglas too.
Exactly. So it speaks. It's in that conversation. Kinesiologists such as Don Bailey, who I thank my lucky stars every day is still alive, were really at the forefront of this, and he was seen internationally as one of the 3 health experts to watch. He's in his 80s, and he is still teaching in Australia over the winter, because he has something to add to the conversation, right. Still. So I would say it's a complicated answer, but health issues aren't just an urban, concern.
No, yeah.
So
no.
And if you look at some of the greatest progressive movements in Canadian history in the 20th century, they did originate in the prairies.
Yes.
So
yes.
yeah.
Yes. It's there's like I say, there's no reason why I'm surprised. I'm just surprised.
I'm not trying to lambast you. I'm just saying.
I love Saskatchewan. I loved it.
And I'm not even from Saskatchewan, but I'm not getting my back up about it. I'm serious.
Now, was the goal was national though? The goal was never regional, provincial, or so. Like the goal was always national.
I haven't had a chance to ask Dr. Bailey that if he had, had this grand vision for a national movement. I know that he wanted to see health promotion in action, and you can see around Saskatoon a lot of the civic centers were developed in the early 1970s as part of that movement. It was an entire movement. I don't know if he ever saw it becoming as large as it did.
Right.
So I can't say. Yeah.
But, well, at least maybe the name, and you talked about this morning, which I thought was good. The name, the selection of the name, could be a clue into that because it works in both languages.
Mm-hmm. Well, the regional campaign drew the attention of the national government under Pierre Trudeau, and he created Sports Participation Canada and asked Lester B. Pearson to be the chair. Philippe de Gaspé de Beaubien, the deuxième, was the president of Quebec-based Telemedia, one of the largest media companies in Quebec at the time, and he was asked to be president. And he was. This is in the wake of the bilingualism, biculturalism debate, and he saw that if they kept Sports Participation in Canada, they would be translating that long and clunky title in every news release and every advertisement. So he proposed a made-up word that fit in both official languages, something that could be recognized. So that's how Participaction was created. And I think it works effectively, and I think it also removes the word Canada, which is extremely important in Quebec during the Quiet Revolution.
Yeah.
So.
That's a really good point. And the way to continue to brand yourself in Quebec and get the support of that province, right? And
Participaction's relationship with Quebec was always very strong, and after the sovereignty referendum in 1995, when Participaction was floundering, it didn't have the funding, and it branded itself as a company rather than a not-for-profit organization. The federal government used it as an activation unit to get to Quebecers on national campaigns. So it was used for Canada 125 as the community activation unit in Quebec. It was used for a variety of national campaigns just because Quebecers didn't necessarily like the Canadian government, but they did like Participaction.
Right. So within that name, and you're trying to gain credibility within Quebec, the whole country, I thought one of the best parts of the presentation was when you started talking about how to get more funding, they had to go to private industry, and there's concerns that maybe you're selling the credibility that you've earned. Now, what was the one example? Was it you talked about dairy specifically?
Well, and this is my concern from reading the primary sources. I look at Project Apex, which was sponsored by the Dairy Nutrition Board of Alberta. I think I might be getting the title wrong on it, but essentially it was the Dairy Board. And they were asked, it was a program that allowed or asked grade 4 to 6 students to keep nutrition journals. And as they were keeping these journals, they were encouraged to up their dairy consumption as part of a healthy diet. Now, you can't look at that and say this corporate sponsor had nothing to do with influencing the programming. There is a link there. There was never anything in the internal memos that showed concern for that. But that's my reading of the primary documents, is that the corporations were starting to influence the programming. Another example would be Healthy Living, or Vie Santé Active, out of New Brunswick, which was a program targeted for seniors, which was completely funded by Big Pharma, by AstraZeneca.
Right.
So and part of that was part of a very large program, but a part of it was that you should take your drugs regularly as part of being a healthy senior. So you can't look at that and say of course, the corporate sponsors had no hand in the programming. They did.
Sure.
So everyone is using Participaction's brand recognition, be it the federal government or corporation, starting in the 1990s. And I think that weakened their volunteer force, because they'd never had a large workforce. They had a lot of volunteers across the nation, and they started to lose those numbers as a result, I think, of these corporate sponsorships and weakening of credibility.
Now, was that just within people who knew what was going on, or was there a general public reaction to those sorts of things?
I don't think the general public had any sort of knowledge of this going on. I'm hoping to interview some of the volunteers who are part of the Participation workforce in the coming months and get a better take on it. But my impression from the people who are completely removed from Participation, other than being consumers, had no awareness that this was going on. They were quite happy to see the humorous ads and be involved in the various campaigns. So.
Yeah. Well, I think one equivalent while you were talking about this that struck me is the Heart and Stroke or Heart and Lung Foundation or Heart and Stroke Foundation.
Yeah.
That they have their little, I don't know if they still do this, but they put their little logo on certain foods that they deem that are approved. And I know Marketplace has done, I think, multiple exposés on this, where essentially whoever gives the most money to the Heart and Stroke Foundation, the Heart and Stroke Foundation will in turn put or this is the argument that Marketplace makes, is that the Heart and Stroke Foundation will put their logo on that food regardless of whether or not it's any good for you. So
and to play the devil's advocate, although I haven't done any research on that, I would say that the Heart and Stroke Foundation would say, we research it, and if it is the healthiest of potato chips, then we will put it on.
Right.
So it's how are you going to frame if this is the best product for consumers? It's all in how you quantify it.
But at what point do you think that do you damage your credibility with the public? And did that happen to Participation specifically through the 90s? Yeah,
I don't think that their credibility was damaged, because their credibility was all that I felt remained when they closed. And that is why when there was that vacuum for those interim years between 2001 and 2007, the federal government said, we need to bring it back. They could have done any sort of health promotion campaign and used a new name, not brought back Hal Johnson and Joan McLeod. They could have done a variety of things, but they saw that credibility and that brand recognition and decided to co-opt it and bring it back. I'm not saying that the new Participation doesn't do great stuff. It does. But we need to recognize that that brand had worth, and that brand still had credibility, even though that there were these internal issues going on, and that is why it was brought back.
And I'll jump ahead to what was going to be another question, but with respect to this new one, do you think that there's a possibility that it could damage the legacy of the original, that people will start to associate the two as the same thing?
I think people do associate the two as the same thing. And, as any continuing organization, sure, they have the potential of dropping the ball. But I haven't studied the new Participation, so I can only speak to it as a Canadian consumer. I think that they are continuing the humorous messages. I think that I'm a little concerned with the fact that their major sponsor is Coke, and that's the first thing you see when you Google their website. So they definitely have the ability to lessen the name of Participation. It's a difficult negotiation. Participation was always dependent on corporate funding and government funding, and the new Participation continues to negotiate that relationship. It's a difficult thing to do. Yeah,
definitely. And with that respect, I mean, maybe it's even worse now than it was in the 90s. Well, I guess in the 90s there was budget cuts too, but you throw in that fact, and you don't really have the government available to the same extent, if at all, when as before maybe you could have gone to them for a little more help.
Yeah, it's interesting. In 96, Diane Marlowe was removed as the Minister of Health, and David Dingwall was brought in. And the primary documents are so much fun and so revealing about the relationship between Russ Kisby and Diane Marlowe. They would meet at Blue Jays games and talk about the budget, and in a time when, things were really getting cut, she was a strong supporter of Kisby and of Participactions. And so their funding was secure. Interestingly, same government, but, when the shuffle happened and Dingwall was brought into that ministry, that support wasn't there. So I think it speaks to, we talk about governments and we talk about movements, but the power of the individual in shaping change, just the difference between a minister could really change the amount of funding that a group like Participaction was going to see.
Right. So in that shuffle,
their funding was decreased significantly, but it was a time when a lot of ministries were being cut, and Marlowe had, I think, sheltered Participaction from a lot of the storm, until Dingwall saw this, this bloated, branch, as he might have seen it, and cut it. I haven't interviewed him, so I'm not sure exactly how he would, shape that conversation. But,
probably in a different way.
Yes,
I would guess.
But its budget was reduced under his watch. So.
Now, but I wonder if, because you talk about the digital age and how Participation was not able to respond to the digital age particularly effectively. I wonder if that model that they were using prior to 2001, over the past 11 years, does that model even work anymore? Like, because you talk about the president, he retired in 2001 because of cancer, which I don't know if that's some sort of morbid irony, but like, does like, to me, if I want to go look up some sort of workout tape or figure out how to exercise or how to eat, I can just Google that now. I don't need someone coming into the school necessarily, or I don't need a commercial little 30-second snippet, mostly because I don't watch commercials and a lot of people don't. Like, so what do you think necessarily led to the end of Participaction, or was it just another confluence of things, or just their inability to respond, or do you think it would have been a natural slow death on that business model anyway?
I think it might have been a slow death on the business model, but again, it's a confluence of conversations. I think the question when you say you could just Google it, why would you Google it? That's what Participaction was trying to do, is try to get Canadians to think about their physical fitness, not necessarily show them how to do it all the time. Body Break did show, but the majority of them were saying just get up and get active, or walk around the block, or do something like that.
Right.
I think you're right. The traditional model probably wouldn't have worked in the digital age, but I think that speaks to a lot of organizations struggling to come to terms with how to advertise and how to reshape their corporate model in the digital age. It's a difficult thing to do, to advertise on the internet. And I want to give credit where credit's due. Participation got a website pretty darn early, and a good portion of the archives is available online. So they did try, but we see in our own industry we just came from a keynote speaker that discussed incorporating media technology in what we do. And it's a difficult thing to do, particularly when those at the helm and those in the workforce are of an older generation.
Right.
And I think about Kisby, and I think about Nancy Colbeck, and the people at the head offices in Montreal and Toronto. They were of a particular generation that may have had a lot of difficulty trying to rethink something that had worked really well for 30 years. So, and I don't think that I don't think that they should be condemned for that. That's just a reality of their particular mindset and situation. We're all sort of influenced by our political times.
Yeah, and that's sort of a natural reaction that you would have, like, something's worked for a long time. I'm still in charge of it. Why would I change it?
Well, and I think that Canadians have always self-identified more by region than by nation.
Yeah.
And I don't think that changed between 1970 and 2001, and that was often their focus, was creating locally designed programming.
Mm-hmm.
But when their funding was cut, they didn't have the resources to do that anymore.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and that causes a problem when you know. But it's interesting in this dynamic, and because so much of the early success was because of its adaptability, and now later on, they just don't have that same the same adaptability, and therefore it leads to its ultimate demise. So it's sort of starting and ending with almost the same buzzword, but just one way they're successful with it, the other way they're not. And it really is an interesting story when you look at it over the whole 30 years or 31 years.
Yeah. And I had an interesting conversation with someone who was with the new Participaction this morning, and they kind of took offense with the rise and fall of health promotion, because they still do very much feel that they are doing health promotion, and they are. I'm concerned with this narrative, the narrative of this organization, and why it was so successful. It was so successful with Canadians.
Yeah.
And yet it ended. And why?
Right.
And that's sort of been the impetus behind the studies.
Yes. Now, do you have a favorite? You showed a commercial this morning.
Yes.
Which was great, and it was there snow? I think there was snow on the ground.
No.
There was no. So there's just two guys running on a trail.
Yeah.
And it says these two guys are in great shape. They have the same health.
Yeah.
And just one of them's a 60-year-old Swede, and one of them's a 30-year-old
Canadian.
Yeah. Now, do you have? Now that's obviously when you showed. So I don't know if that answers the question. Do you have a favorite commercial or favorite anything? Like, what's your favorite thing that you found so far?
Favorite thing? Well, let me address that one first.
Okay.
So we're of a particular generation,
Yes.
and we remember Hal Johnson and Joe McLeod.
Of course.
But when I pitched the idea of this dissertation to my advisor, Dr. Kornek, and I said, I'm interested in Participaction, and she said, oh, well, you'll be looking at the 60-year-old Swede. It has...
Oh, wow.
So it's generational. The 60-year-old Swede was something that ran for years, and that the Canadians who are 40 and over would know when they thought of Participaction, they would think of the 60-year-old Swede. So that's why I showed it. I was playing to my audience, because that's who the majority of academics are.
Right.
My favorite, they produced so much stuff, and the one that made me laugh out loud in the archives was this Christmas card of a Santa Claus, and it's just a Santa Claus, chubby guy in a red suit. Very straightforward. You open up the card, and he's busted open his suit like Superman, and he's ripped and has a Participaction shirt on. And there's so many. Michael Fogg was the artist. He did all of the sort of Participaction ads. And there's so many great Michael Fogg cartoons, but that one made me laugh out loud. And after a day of looking through internal documents, it brought a smile to my face. So, yeah.
And just as a side note, I'm sure Valerie Kornek just likes that you threw her age up on the podcast.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know what? I said that she was in the 40 above category. I didn't say exactly where in the 40 or above category.
I can edit that out if you want.
No, I'm cool. I know she will be too. I might have to buy her a beer, but that's okay.
That makes up for everything.
It does.
But you've also been talking to, in addition to these ads and stuff, you've been talking to people who remember coming to their schools or just random events in communities. In terms of these sorts of anecdotes, is there anything that really stands out? Because in terms of this brand recognition, it's not just seeing it on TV or seeing a paper ad. There's obviously these events that are going on too. So out of that, is there anything that really stands out?
I mentioned it today in the question period. People often talk about their experience in schools, and that if you were able to do this many chin-ups and this many laps around the track, you'd get a gold medal. Otherwise, you would get a silver or a bronze. And more often than not, I'm hearing people who were seriously crushed because they weren't able to get the gold Participaction medal. And when I tell people I'm doing Participaction, they'll say, "Well, I didn't get the gold medal," and they didn't give us any warning that we were doing the test, and I'd eaten a really big lunch, and these are fresh wounds that people are talking about, and I'm not. And it's interesting that overwhelmingly they're negative memories. These people were not happy that they didn't get that gold medal, and I don't know if it's because I'm often speaking to my research with academics who are goal-oriented but not necessarily very physically fit people,
right?
Or if that's the general consensus. And so I'm continuing to speak to people about this, to know if this in-school programming was in fact detrimental to people's visions of their physical fitness and of their health. Yeah,
well, you'd hate to think that Canada's failures at the 1988 Olympics were directly related to 10-year-olds not getting participation medals
in 1978.
Yeah,
that is a link I don't want to try with this study.
That would be something else. You're completely just breaking
it open.
Talk about legacies. Like that would really.
Well, and sports history is a hot topic right now. I'm sure someone will take that and run with it. But the head archivist at the University of Saskatchewan Archives, Cheryl Ennals, she's in charge of this particular fall, was thrilled and is so helpful with all of this material. And no one has looked at it extensively besides me. And there are hundreds of theses and dissertations in this stuff. Like, I'm looking at it as a cultural history. But you could do an entire master's thesis on the Crown Life Challenge, or Participaction's programming for the Canadian Forces. They looked at mental health. They looked at a variety of topics. They're programming for children. A historian of children would have a field day with what's in there. So there's so much that can be done with this particular archives. I'm only scratching the surface.
And it's all in Saskatoon?
All in Saskatoon.
At the University Library?
University Library, 3rd floor. And some of it's available online. Russ Kisby, when he was diagnosed with cancer and realized that it was going to end his life, he put everything in the repository, and he made notes of every campaign, what its objectives were, and was it successful. And although he tried to produce these sort of archival, overhead documents as objective, they have very subtle tones that are really great to get an insight on how he felt about all of the different campaigns. Right. And he did, there are oral interviews that he did about various campaigns. So he had I'm glad he took advantage of it, but he had an interesting opportunity as someone who was involved in the organization for almost its entire run, who knew that it was over, knew that his life was ending, and took the opportunity to document, and make sure that this was available to the public. So it's not like it's someone's child who's dropped it off and said, I knew Dad was kind of important and someone might be interested in this. He took a lot of time to make sure that his work was remembered. Yeah. And I have to always be aware of his political desires when I am looking at this archives.
Sure, yeah.
But for the most part, it isn't censored. Like, I'm finding internal documents that, aren't always painting Participation in the most positive light. So it doesn't seem to be all that censored, which is wonderful.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's such a great gift that he gave.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say it's too bad, because obviously it works out well for you that it took 10 years.
For no one to look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For someone to take advantage of that. The other thing I thought was really striking this morning, and this is not to make any comment on the other panelist, but you were also placed with a presentation on smoking.
Yes.
That, I don't know why, but that just struck me as funny. Now, did you find that there was something strange about that, or because she was talking about the culture of smoking and women specifically, and why women smoke and all this, and you're talking about health promotion, so the two things kind of fly in the face of each other, and she's talking about how this culture of smoking, and women are drawn to it even though they know it's bad and that a lot of them are going to die from doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And that here you are talking about the struggle of health promotion, and it was this really weird dichotomy in the room. Did you know, like,
the panel seemed very interesting to me, in that it was Linda Keeley tried to make, and somewhat successfully tried to make the link between health, community health, incorporating Allison's discussion of adoption as being sort of the central focus.
Yeah. Allison Stevenson, also from the University of Saskatchewan, she was talking about adoption.
Yes, the adoption of Indian and Métis program, or the 60s Snatch, as it's sometimes popularly known, Aboriginal children being adopted by non-Aboriginal parents,
right? And
the sort of legacy of
that.
So.
And then the other one, Women Smokers, was Sharon Cook from the University of Ottawa.
And that's it's a cultural history of health, and it's looking at the media's relationship with a health issue. So the link can be made. Participation is a very difficult topic for academics to wrap their head around or to classify. I often get asked, so it's a sports history.
Right.
Well, no, it's not sports history. So it's a kinesiology. No. Institutional. No. It's a media history. Yeah. In some ways, it's a cultural history. It has to be in conversation with all of these historiographic debates and issues, but it doesn't neatly fall into any of them.
Right.
And so I find it's difficult to place on a panel. I looked at,
but in terms of Sharon's presentation, do you find that participation is essentially what they're fighting is this culture that she's talking about? And so here she is talking about how pervasive it is and how women are drawn to it despite all the things that, say, participation and other groups are doing. Now, does that add a different level of context to what you're doing, or are they separate enough that they're just distinct items?
I think participation is pushing against that, because hers is in such an earlier period.
Right.
It's difficult to sort of make direct links, but yeah, I would have to say, like, it was difficult to sort of make an argument for the two of them being together.
Yeah. Well, this is by no means meant to criticize.
No.
The organization committee.
You know what? I am tickled that participation made it to Congress. That was when I created the paper proposal. I honestly didn't think that it would. So anywhere that they're willing to squeeze me in, I appreciate. And I think Linda Keeley did a great job of making those links.
She did.
But
she really did. And all three papers were really good. And you're right. Linda Keeley did bring them together in this community health idea, and it was a very interesting panel to sit in on. Although I will say there was another one I also wanted to go to, but you can't
thank you.
You can't be in two places at once.
I was thrilled with the turnout.
Great turnout.
Yeah, I presented at Boston College in March, and I presented to 5 people, and one of them was the husband of the other person on the panel, and to travel all that way to know that you're only really presenting to 4 people who are interested it's a bit demoralizing. So it's great to see a large group come out.
Yeah, because I've heard stories. This is my first time at Congress, and I've heard stories that because there's 6 or 7 panels running simultaneously, that you get sparse crowds. But selfishly for me, I had a pretty good turnout.
You had a great turnout.
Like not just me, but I was with Barbara Freeman as well. And so we had in the CBC panel, which was kind of fun. But every panel that I've been to has been pretty well attended. So those rumors of poor attendance, if they were true past years, they don't appear to be true.
True here.
This year.
I was speaking to a master's student who's presenting tomorrow afternoon, I think.
Yeah, we'll see what it's like tomorrow.
Exactly. And
this is Tuesday of Congress.
Tuesday of Congress. And she does medical history. And in some ways I'm in conversation with that. I've got a minor field in medical history, and this does, some of the issues of state control of the body and all that stuff is very much part of participation. Anyway, she's presenting on a medical panel, and she has been forewarned that there will be no one there. So I think it depends, of course, on the day and the topic. You and I have been sort of focusing on some of the media focused stuff. So we've attended a lot of the same panels, and they've been well attended. But I often think it's a shame that all of the people who work in Indigenous and First Nations history attend the one session in every block that focuses on that, and they sort of go as a cohort. And media historians such as you and I, we do the same thing. And so we do get to hear a lot of papers from our field, but we don't get to sort of get a flavor of the other.
Right, those networking opportunities, you're networking with people within your own sort of area.
Exactly. So, and I feel for the people who don't have that strong a group, such as potentially medical history at the CHA that isn't as big.
And that's maybe why they get put sort of all over the place, because at least like yesterday, the one room, I was in that room all day because it was just media like the whole day through that room. So if you're not part of something that can be streamed together in that way, you're sort of put wherever. And I organized a student conference at the University of Ottawa this year, and putting together panels and then scheduling them and figuring out, like, we only had 2 rooms, and figuring out what to put against each other. That's the hardest thing in the world. I can't imagine how hard it is here. And
you can't please everyone, and someone's always going to complain. So they do a great job.
Fantastic job.
But it's just a shame you can't go to the mall.
I know, but then we'd be here for 3 weeks, and I don't think we can afford to do that.
No.
So if anybody's listening to this and has a great participation story,
you can contact me via email at victoria.drover, DROVER, at hotmail.com.
Terrific.
And I would love to hear your participation story.
Okay, we'll throw that up on the website too. What else you got coming up? Any other conferences, publications? What's going on? I'm
presenting at Directions West in Calgary at the end of June. I'm teaching in the interim an intensive 3-week course in Canadian history. 150 years of history in 3 weeks. Those students are going to be pretty darn tired. And I have a current article submission at the Journal of Religious History based on my master's work, if anyone's interested in university history and Presbyterianism and progressivism on the prairies. So
very, very different.
Very different. I like to sample the cultural histories of Canadian 20th century histories.
Why not?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And if anybody has any questions, comments about today's edition, we'll throw Victoria's email up on the website. You can also email the podcast itself at historyslam@gmail.com. And I'm going to start using Twitter more frequently. I've signed up, but I don't actually tweet anything yet. But once we start posting these, I'll tweet. And my handle is at Dr. Shawnee Fever.
The doctor, nice.
Yeah, it's a WKRP Cincinnati reference.
Yeah.
I didn't know how I felt about it for a while, but I'm just going to go with it and see what happens. So you can hit us up there, and we will see everybody on the next issue or edition of the History Slam.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Check out ActiveHistory.ca for more features and articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.